What is up, everybody? It is Alex from Heavy New York calling from Zoom again. This time we are here with novelist and contributor to the New York Times Magazine. We are here with John Wray. Thank you so much for being here. It is great to have you here.
It's awesome to be here. Thanks for having me.
Anytime, man. Anytime. Your new novel, Gone with the Wolves, or Gone to the Wolves, is absolutely awesome. I just started getting into it now. I got to tell you that I, as a music journalist, have shared many of the struggles with Kip, one of the characters in the novel. Definitely really a relatable character for me. Was this a vision that you had in mind for a while? Like, was this sort of like a novel that you always had in mind throughout your career? Or was this sort of like a spur of the moment idea where it just like inspiration sort of struck out of nowhere?
Well, I grew up in Buffalo at a time when there was a lot of stuff going on there, and when heavy music and particularly metal was pretty important. When I was growing up was around the same time the Cannibal Corpse was coming up in Buffalo. So growing up in the Cannibal Corpse era, it just kind of gets into your under your skin, and into your blood. And I remember as a teenager going from being totally terrified by not just Cannibal Corpse, but by not even having the guts to go to a metal show, to feeling pretty at home in that environment. Um, I don't know why it took me so long to write about metal. It's like I'm not really someone who writes about their own life very much. Um, so sometimes the obvious things, the things that would make for the most amazing stories, don't necessarily occur to me for a while. I also bumped into this kid, got to know this kid from Florida, from Venice, Florida, and he and I got talking about like the 80s and the 90s, the death metal scene down there. And I think that just kind of started stirring stuff up in my brain. And I'd written about metal and as a music journalist, as you mentioned. And suddenly it just kind of hit me that this is a completely underrepresented subject, certainly in the world of novels, and I was just like, why hasn't anyone ever really written a novel about it? It really like takes this world really seriously and tries to communicate the excitement and the joy of it and the way that it gives a lot of kids, I think, who may not have a lot of other stuff going on in their lives, like a real place of shelter and safety, which is not something that people usually associate with metal, I would say.
Of course. Well, I mean, yeah, and I'm sure when you finally, cutting your teeth in, the days of Buffalo, New York, you probably stepped in and out of Cabbage's, the record store back in the day, and ran into all those guys, only to realize that the guys in Cannibal Corpse are absolute teddy bears.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing that everyone says who writes about music and comes into contact with people in the scene. It's like, that first moment when you realize that, the dudes in the metal scene are probably actually nicer than your average, like, I mean, all the fucked up stuff that I saw growing up in Buffalo, none of it was really involved metalheads at all. It was mostly like creepy, preppy quarterback types. Um, it's a funny contradiction. I don't even know how to explain it, but it continues to this day. I remember I was writing about Sun about, I don't know, 12, 15 years ago. And someone had told me like, oh yeah, Stephen O'Malley from Sun, he's kind of hard to talk to and stuff. And I remember they were playing this noise festival here in New York, over in Red Hook, and they were like hanging out on this fire escape outside this kind of warehouse building. And I was going up the fire escape, and they had like their robes on, and like they were all decked out, ready to go. And I remember going up the fire escape and thinking like, okay, maybe these guys could be like a little hard to talk to or a little scary. And they were having this intense conversation. And as I got closer and closer, like as I made my way up the fire escape, I heard that what they were saying was, the first thing I heard, I think it was Greg say, was, yeah, life on the road, man, it's so hard on relationships, it's so hard to like keep the intimacy there and the love, and like they were just talking about how it was hard to be in a touring band and like still be close with your girlfriend.
Yeah.
And that's when I was like, yeah, these guys are just, they're just sweethearts, and they ended up being so fun to talk to and interested in so many different kinds of music you would never expect,
Yeah, of course.
like Greg is a huge Stevie Wonder fan, and he loves that 70s Stevie Wonder era, like who on earth would ever think that?
Every
So those are
metalhead.
some of the kind of surprising things and the contradictions I wanted to sort of write about, to so that even someone who comes to the book not knowing anything about metal or any of those scenes, and maybe someone who's a little freaked out by it, would leave the book, would like put it down with a much more sophisticated and complex understanding.
Well, there's what I found, so, like a lot of novels now, like I'm starting to see more and more literature be written about metal. Like a good friend of mine who's an author, William Berger, just released a fantastic book about metal against fighting patriarchy called The Metaliad, which I highly
Uh-huh.
recommend. A very
Yeah.
fantastic book. And like you're 100% right. Like, it's so funny. Like, we all listen to death metal and black metal and those evil stuff, but like, people wouldn't believe, people don't believe me when I say, the first artist who got me into music was Whitney Houston and Mariah Carey. Like, oh, everybody has their sort of a gateway into leading it. Writing about something that is like a little bit more rooted in your, it's not an autobiography, but like, that is more rooted in like your experience with heavy metal. Would you say like Gone to the Wolves you have like a more of an attachment or connection with than a novel such as The Right Hand of Sleep or Lowboy or Lost Time Accidents? In a way, would you say you relate to this novel more than any other novel you've written?
Well, it was the most fun novel for me to write, for sure. I just had such a good time writing about it, remembering stuff, and also kind of getting deeper into some scenes that I didn't know that much about. I mean, I never really was a part of that sort of second wave of black metal that happened in Norway and Sweden. It was more like hearing rumors about it and I listen to Bathory, but like those like really really the kind of now infamous bands like Mayhem and Burzum and all of those bands, Immortal. I it wasn't, for whatever reason, it wasn't my cup of tea at the time. Um, and it was of course to really go, which sort of up scenes. I can't say that I'm going to be putting on Mayhem, on a regular basis.
Hmm.
But it's just another kind of angle and element of that world that was super interesting to get into. I mean, you have to always kind of care about your characters, even the creepy, questionable ones, or else you're not really going to pay attention to them, and you're not going to make them real in a way, like books where the author doesn't really care about the characters, or sometimes you can tell that, like, okay, the villain, right, so to speak, is someone the author couldn't relate to, and therefore the villain's kind of boring, kind of flat.
Yeah.
So I always try to care about all the characters, but I do have a soft spot for these, especially for the three sort of metals true believers that are, the three friends that are at the heart of the novel. I mean, they are very dear to my heart, I have to say.
Yeah, I was gonna ask because, like I said, I very much relate to Kip. Just from being the music journalist, and that world in itself is quite an adventure, to say the least. But
Yeah.
would Kip, Leslie, and Kira, do they almost serve as maybe like metaphors in a way for people you've had in your life, in a way, or were you almost kind of like creating somebody from scratch who may not have may have been close with, but like maybe you are just kind of like, because there are metal stereotypes out there. Let's be real.
Sure.
So like, are they meant to sort of like portray metal in itself more so than a personal acquaintance of yours?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, if anything, I mean, to a large degree, they're based on people that I know. I mean, the character of Leslie, who's this somewhat unlikely metalhead, who's kind of openly gay or at least bisexual, and he's African American. He's growing up in West Florida. Um, he's actually based on someone that I know really well and a good friend of mine, you know. Um, and it was fun to write about him because again, it's sort of that sort of runs counter to a lot of people's ideas about the world of extreme metal, you know, quote unquote, which they think of as super white, super straight, essentially just male, you know, and none of that is really true, at least not across the board, you know. So the character of Leslie was really fun for that reason. The character of Kip, as you mentioned, you know, he's sort of like our point of view as we're going through the novel, and he's probably the closest to me in a number of ways. I mean, he ends up writing for zines and writing about music, and that's something that I do too. And certainly his problems with the music industry and writing about music and you know the weird stuff he ends up having to do to you know with these bands that he's kind of traveling with and all the weird zines he writes for that was all stuff that came more or less out of my own life, you know, so he was really easy to write. And I tried to hopefully make him a little bit more complex too, because I don't think of myself as a very typical metalhead. Although, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
You know, my hope was by the end of the book, people are like, oh, maybe there is no one type of person, you know, who listens to this music. And also with Kira, the third of the three friends, you know, we're talking about, you know, she's a girl when it starts out, she's in her teens, and then she matures into a woman. But she's kind of really like the coolest one of the three of them, and the most badass, and the most kind of like metal with a capital M, really, the way I think about it. But she's also a woman, you know. That again, that I think in a way, I was hoping that the three main characters of the book, taken together, would really show the kind of spectrum and the sort of variety of people who can be into metal, you know.
Of course.
That was definitely a little kind of secret agenda that I had for sure.
Yeah, and that's totally prevalent. Like, you know, when I go to a concert pretty much almost every day, in a way, and like, you know, I went to a bunch of death metal shows last week. I saw Morbid Angel last week and Dying Fetus last week. Death metal shows like that are more, you know, they're a death metal show, but like but a couple weeks before I went to see Static X and Fear Factory, which has more of like the new metal audience into it. And then, you know, like I'd also been to, you know, and this is for lack of better words, I hate the terminology, but like more like butt rock oriented shows as well. Like, you know, just it's such a funny category. But, you know, also last week I went to see August Burns Red, which is a metalcore audience. So like you know, like at this point I know which regular people I'm gonna see at which specific show. I know what the sort of like fashion is gonna be like, or what type of shirts I'm gonna see. It is actually a pretty interesting to see how there's so much diversity in one sort of scene. Rather, it almost seems like that there is no stereotypical metalhead, that there is, as this I feel like this book really does entail.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the most fascinating things about metal from, I guess, from an outsider standpoint, or one of the things I think would really surprise a lot of people who don't listen to it, is just the unbelievable diversity. You know, I always try to describe it to people as like this sort of kind of musical culture and movement that started out as like more or less a single kind of stream, and then just forked and kept forking and kept forking. It's almost like a fractal thing, you know, where you have so many subgenres, subgenres. I mean, it just keeps forking and becoming more complex. And you have all of these sort of micro communities, which have there's a lot of overlap because, you know, like you said, you can be into, you know, a person could be conceivably into metalcore and then also into, you know, Scandinavian black metal, but also into, you know, who knows, hair metal ballads, you know what I mean? Like it can run the whole gamut. And yet there's so much, it's so heterogeneous. There's so much variety and so much passion in these kind of like almost sects, you could say. It's like a religion that has kept having like kind of little little divisions and little kind of forkings of the path. It's so complex and so interesting, and you don't really see that in to the same degree in a lot of other sort of genres of rock music, for sure.
Yeah.
I really don't think so. And you know, the question of why that is endlessly fascinating. You know, but in part, it's just that worldwide there are so many people starting metal bands all the time,
Hmm.
and every time you start a band, you get to decide what direction you're going into, and usually it's like you're hybridizing different influences, and then out of it comes a new sort of genre. You know,
Yeah. Well, what I find
that's super fun. I think that's super fun.
what I find so integral about metal, and this isn't like for footage sake or anything like that. Look, it's obvious. There's very little times where people in bands do this as their full time job. Some of the biggest bands you see on stage work in other endeavors and other things to help pay their bills and whatnot. But you still see
Yeah, I mean
people.
that comes with making underground art of any kind.
Of course. And but you know what? That's how people. I don't know a single person who's getting into metal for the money. You know what I mean?
Right, right.
Some people look. There's some people in the world of rap, and James Hetfield himself mentioned it too. Like when Dr. Dre was on board with Two against Napster, everybody in rap was like, well, it's all about money anyway. So like there's just it. Like, but in metal, people know that you're not gonna become Elon Musk level wealthy by doing this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, I think really when you see those people on the stage, regardless if they're playing in front of 1,000 people or playing in front of 10 people, there is passion behind it. And
Yeah.
and we all know that we have our day jobs in the morning the next day, but we're getting ready to move on to the next week.
Yeah, it's kind of like writing books in that way, you know, like there are maybe a few people who are making the big bucks writing books or writing novels, but the vast majority of people are doing it because they have something to say, and it seems to be like the only way that they can say it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, you look at the time when there was the most money to be made in metal, which was obviously the 80s, I would say. And that's also a period of time when you had a lot of crap being made, of course, by bands who were just like, oh, let's go to the Sunset Strip in LA and wear funny clothes and, you know, get laid a lot and hopefully end up with like a Ferrari and a mansion, you know. There's a lot of bad music that got made in that period, you
Yeah,
know.
and it's
A
worked
lot of great.
unfortunately for some people, which is
Yeah,
more
yeah,
infuriating.
which is yeah. I mean, you know, you've got Poison is still touring. You know, I mean, nothing against Poison,
Yeah.
but these guys are still making money. You know, because they managed to penetrate the mainstream, and that kind of success it declines over years, but they've got enough to fill like I guess smaller stadiums still or something.
Yeah.
Even then, you had of course a lot of people making very different kinds of music, different kinds of metal who weren't ever going to make that kind of money.
Yeah.
Which was fun to write about too, that period, because there was such a conflict and there really were, you know, that was a period of time in metal when there really was a lot of mutual hostility and aggression. And it's like there was this sense that people were kind of fighting for the future of the culture, even, you know. Metal was being attacked by the mainstream, by the government, but you also had like you know, especially out in California, where the middle section of my book is set. You had like the thrash kids versus the glam kids, and you had brawls, and you had tons of hostility going back and forth. Um, Even though you know a lot of times in secret, the thrash dudes would still be going to the glam shows because that's where the girls were. You
Yeah,
know.
of course. All of that like rivalry, like there was a time where fans of black metal hated death metal kids, and everybody liked to hate on the new metal kids or whatever. All that was just, I think, a facade. In the end, really nobody gave a shit when you were at that show. So
Yeah, but they were kind of trying, you know, especially when you're young and you've just started your band or whatever, you know. When I think about like that second wave of black metal in Oslo and you know Stockholm, they were trying to set themselves apart from their influences, you know. I mean, those kids Euronymous and Varg Vikernes and all those guys, they were hugely influenced by death metal, particularly.
Yeah.
Like
And they were
Deus,
rich kids.
Obituary, Morbid Angel, all those bands were huge influences on them. But they didn't want it. They wanted to have their own thing. So they, of course, they had to specifically crap on those bands, because it was a way of, they wanted, they were like, it's that anxiety of influence thing where you have to like kind of kill your artistic parents so that you can kind of step up center stage.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just that. It's and in a way then it can almost be a healthy sign. It can be a sign that there's like people feel like they need to fight for their place in the sort of history books. Unfortunately, in the case of all those guys in Norway, particularly, one of the ways they decided they could kind of set themselves apart was by taking everything super literally.
Yeah.
Which is something you can only probably do when you're like 19 years old.
Yeah.
But to me, that's the way that I understand that period of time and the crimes that occurred in that era. It was just sort of like young, because they were really, really young, which
They
a
were
lot of
young,
people
stupid.
forget.
They were young and stupid. And on top of that, like they weren't traumatized. Like they didn't grow up like in abject poverty. Like
No,
they were rich suburban kids. The only, if you want to talk about true black metal, the only one who was really, I would say, true was Dead, and he was just a sick human being. Like
yeah,
so.
yeah. I mean, we could have a whole conversation about how no one really gave a shit about Dead until he blew his brains out.
Yeah, which
You
which is
know,
fucked up. The real thing I've always analyzed about black metal is because black metal always, the real elitists like to either shit on emo or new metal. Black metal,
yeah.
I've always said, is the sister genre of emo. When you look at it, no, because when you look at it, first off, all the kids
I know I hear you.
yeah, yeah. First off, all the kids who grew up listening to My Chemical Romance and the Used are now very much into Mayhem and Emperor. But like
Yeah,
you looked at the suburbs in Norway where they all grew up, and where like how they would try to be these rebellious aspects. A lot of the where emo was popular was in the suburb kids who had either supportive or relatively wealthy parents, and they just wanted this depressing nature as a means to rebel against it. So in the end, I think emo and black metal really came up in from a similar sort of poisonous tree.
and they're both forms of music that really romanticize depression.
Yep.
You know, which is fine. I've got nothing. I've got no problem with that. It all depends on how good the music is. You know what I
Of course.
mean? But I mean, I'm sure that probably the next thing I say is going to find vocal disagreement with a bunch of your listeners. But I post Bathory, or rather, let's say for me, Bathory is the last musically interesting band from Scandinavia until Emperor later in their career started making those really complex records that I really love, like Anthem to the Welkin at Dusk and things like that. But in between, for me personally, most of that music is just not as good as the best death metal.
You should listen to the band Life Lover. They're a black metal band from Sweden. They're not around anymore, but they broke up after their guitar player died. But they started in 2005, and
Okay, but see,
yeah,
I'm talking about, yeah, then more interesting things started happening again. But like what people think of as like the glory days of second generation Scandinavian black metal, like with Euronymous and Varg Vikernes and all that, that's sort of the so-called black circle, in Oslo and Bergen, like Old Funeral and which is a little earlier. But to me, it's just not that interesting, as music. What people talk about when they talk about those guys is like, oh, they were so hardcore and they burned down churches and they fucking killed people or themselves. And I agree that that's interesting stuff to talk about, but you're not talking about music anymore when you're
Yeah.
talking about that.
Of course. Of course, absolutely. It's like talking about any other gimmick in metal.
Right.
So, I wanted to
Yeah.
talk. I wanted to talk a little bit more about your approach as a writer because like after learning about Gone to the Wolves, I tried to scam a little bit of your other literature works. Granted, I was only reading the Amazon descriptions at because of the
Not
time.
required reading. Not required.
Yeah, but just doing like a quick bit of Amazon descriptions, just to. But like
Gotcha.
when it comes to the writing, does every novel that you write, is there like a blanket art to the art of writing novels that apply to the Right Hand of Sleep, that apply to Godsend, that apply to everything, or does every novel require a new approach?
I'm tempted just to say every novel requires a new approach, but as with most things, the answer is somewhere in the middle. You know, um, the absolute requirement for writing any kind of book, that doesn't matter, novel, nonfiction, whatever, is you have to be genuinely, truly fascinated by what you're writing about. You have to be genuinely interested in the world that you're creating, because you're creating a world, even if you're writing something set in, like, on the Sunset Strip of Los Angeles in the 80s during the kind of glam metal heyday, which part of Gone to the Wolves is set there. But you're still creating it on the page. You're not, like, you weren't there, or I was not there, in the 80s. I was still in Buffalo. You know what I mean? So it's there's world building just the same as, George R. R. Martin did world building for Game of Thrones. It's just happens to look a lot like our world. So you have to be really, really fascinated by what you're writing about.
Of course.
If you are, then you're going to pay real close attention to what you're doing, and you're going to work really hard because it's what you sincerely want to be doing. Um, and yeah, I mean, a novel has to have a beginning, a middle, and end. Things need to build. There needs to be conflict. There need to be, that horrible word stakes that everybody talks about when they talk about writing in movies. Like, what, the stakes need to be higher. But it's all true. I mean, there has to be suspense. It has to be fun to read on some level. I mean, no one wants to write a book that people think of as homework.
Of course.
But obviously, if I'm writing about, small town Florida in the sort of death metal boom years, it's gonna need a different kind of language. It's gonna need a different kind of rhythm and a different atmosphere for sure than, some of my other books. If I'm writing about like a kid in Afghanistan, it's just not gonna be the same because it's a different environment, different culture, different world.
Of course.
It's a mix of, like, sort of like taking what you've learned from having written earlier books, but also finding the right kind of rhythm and style and language and mood for the new thing every time.
Well, speaking of rhythm, because and I ask artists this too when they're making an album or a song. But you're working on a novel. You're not finishing it in one day, maybe not one week. Yeah, but and I've always
Definitely not.
yeah, and I've always wondered about that because like it's you got to keep a novel, whether it be in the beginning, middle, or end, emotionally engaging, and you need to keep that juice sort of like flowing in a way. So when
Yeah.
you work on something for a long period of time, how do you sort of maintain the initial inspiration that sparked it? Do you almost kind of like to feel the same way when you end a project as you do when you start it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. You never feel the same when you end as when you start, because it takes years, right? It's like, did you feel the same, last day of senior year of high school as you did when you were a freshman? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, we're talking about that length of time. But if the story's working, then each page carries you on into the next page, and there is like a continuum. You know what I mean? It's sort of like getting, you're going down a river every morning. You push your little canoe out. The current carries you down a little bit. Then you're done, and you beach the canoe again. You gotta wait till the next day. When it's going well, that's really how it feels. It almost feels effortless. You just need to dip back into that river.
Yeah.
Of course, a lot of the time that's not how it feels, and it's just a huge pain in the ass. You know what I mean? And
Absolutely.
then you got to find other ways to keep yourself interested and to keep yourself, to work off the nervous energy that you have. Here, I'll show you. I work down in my basement, and I'm a drummer. I don't know if you can see, this is my desk, and can you see the drum
Oh,
kit?
quite an awesome cave you got down there.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's great here. Can you see the kit? I can't
Yeah, yeah,
tell.
yeah. I got you. Wow, that's a
All
nice kit
right.
too.
So I spend a lot of time just like, banging it out, literally banging it out. And just trying to, like I got lots of little toys down here to keep me busy. I made some really, really bad music down here over the last few years, just keeping myself entertained.
Well, and you led me perfectly into this next question too, because when it comes to the term inspiration, in a way, is inspiration really something that could be sought out, like pulling a book off of a shelf, in a way, or is inspiration really something that just has to strike you?
Well, I have really strong feelings about this. You'll get a different answer from probably everybody that you ask.
Which is why I love asking
But
it.
yeah, I think the whole idea of inspiration and the muse, is just total horse shit. It might, I mean, for songwriting or for, I don't know, painting or poetry, that may be what you need because, first of all, you got to have a lot of different ideas, and it's something that you can do in a day, if you're lucky, if it's really, like Keith Richards famously said that he wrote I Can't Get No Satisfaction in like 20 minutes. He woke up one morning, he had like a riff in his head, and 20 minutes later, before he had breakfast, he'd written the whole fucking song. It's like considered the greatest rock song of all time. You can't do that with a book. You can't do that with a novel, or probably like a nonfiction book. It's more of a slog, man. It's really not. It's not that exciting. You probably know this. It's not that exciting kind of artist's life that you imagine, where you're just like smoking French cigarettes in some cafe, sipping red wine until 3 in the morning, and then suddenly you write all night and you have a new chapter. It's just years of repetitive drudgery, to be honest, which is why you have to really, really be interested in what you're writing about, and you have to really want to go back into that really basically imaginary world every morning, or at least, let's say, 2 mornings out of 3. You
Yeah,
know,
of course.
once you get it started, I mean, you probably do need, quote unquote, a flash of inspiration to write that first page or to get that first concept and to say, oh yeah, metal kids in the 80s and 90s, that could be cool. Like, that is, of course, you have to have that first idea. But once you have page one written, you get up in the morning, you go downstairs, you make yourself a cup of coffee or whatever your drug of choice is, and then you read the page that you wrote the day before, and you kind of wade into that sort of shallow end of the pool, and get into there until the water's like here. And then when you feel like you're really floating in it, you go for it. Sometimes that takes hours, and sometimes you have days where it doesn't even happen. But if you start thinking about, oh God, I'm not feeling inspired today, I got to wait for inspiration to strike, a fucking year will go by, because we're all lazy fuckers. Like we'd all rather just have the book done already. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if you I think that if you open that little hatch, you have that little get out of jail free card of saying, oh, I'm just not inspired today, you're never going to get done.
Yeah, my
Just
tattoo.
sit down, write crap, and throw it out tomorrow.
Yeah,
But you got to do it every day, because books just, they take years.
yeah. My tattoo artist once said that if she only tattooed when she was inspired, she wouldn't eat. Like
Right.
and there's like I'm a painter and myself, and like there's times where I just want to paint, but then like there's like days where like, okay, I need to take a mental health break and relax, but when I'm taking that mental
Sure.
health break when I'm taking that mental health break, it's almost like creeping on my conscience, like, you lazy fucker, get the fuck off the couch. Like you like that happens all the time. And my writing teacher, who's also one of my favorite authors, Simon Van Boy, told me that he said in an interview his favorite place to write is actually in bed. He like keeps his laptop next to him so he
Sure.
could drift away into dreams and then wake up and just go right into it. So
Yeah, I know a lot of people who do that, or at least I know a few people who work in bed. It doesn't really matter, where you work. And I don't want to give the impression that like you have to write all day long every day. I mean, that just never works. The truth is, if I had a little timer and I was clicking like pure work time, right? It would probably be like a couple hours a day. There's surrounding that though, there's procrastination and like beating yourself up and like taking a walk and like picking up a book to read or like checking something or trying to get inspiration from someone else's work. The actual work time is probably just, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours.
yeah, I
Um,
yeah, that's why I think a
and then
lot of
you're kind of burned out, but that's okay.
mhm,
I usually have like a quota of words that I want to do, not every day, but every day I really am working,
mhm.
because that kind of forces me to not come up with sort of bullshit excuses.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe that's why. Like, part of me wonders. Like, I love James Joyce, and I love Dubliners because of that series of
Yeah.
short stories. Maybe that's sort of like maybe the fine line in a way. Maybe that's sort of like the compromise. I've always said, don't want to write a novel, write an essay or something like that. But even
Yeah.
that could take a while too to make it right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, Joyce was like a very particular kind of genius. I don't know. I really don't know what his routine was. He seemed to not have to change a lot once he wrote something down. There are certain artists, no matter what you're talking about, music, writing, painting, that like copy little tricks that they had, things that helped them to get work done. And then there are some who are just such kind of towering giants that it can be dangerous to try to imitate them.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as I can tell, Joyce spent most of his time just drunk, hanging out, like doing anything but working. But when he was working, he could be surrounded by like his screaming kids on like a noisy street in Trieste in Italy where he lived for a long time, and he would still just like crank out this brilliant stuff.
Yeah. That
I feel like you can
infuriates me.
always learn from like the kind of slightly above average artists more than you can learn from the geniuses.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, Caravaggio, one of my favorite painters, and it pisses me off to this day. All he would paint, he would get wasted, and then go around with a Roman short sword and just beat people up with it. He killed somebody on the squash court, and he got away with everything because he was such a good painter, and that just drove me insane. Like, I wish I was good enough to the point where I could get away with murder. That's when you know you're an accomplished artist. So,
Yeah,
um,
he was a real brawler, wasn't he, Caravaggio?
oh, he was. I would consider him the first. I think he was the one who laid down the concept of a bad boy artist in a way.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
yeah,
that could be.
yep, the first real punk rocker.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Those guys were crazy back then.
Oh God, good times. I want a time machine so bad. So before we
But they
go,
were all like in those days they were all dependent on some patron.
yeah,
They basically had a boss, who had to be pleased with what they did.
yep. And for
So
Caravaggio was the Pope, and you know you did a
yeah.
good job as a painter when you could get drunk and murder people, and the Pope still loves you.
Yeah, well, the popes in those days were pretty shady characters too.
Yeah, that is true. The first mafia.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So before we go, I want to thank you so much for your time today, for being able to start this week off with such an awesome conversation. Just
Oh man, it was super fun.
oh, thank you, thank you. Just Gone to the Wolves is a fantastic novel. I encourage everybody to read it. Just is there anything that else you would like to promote? Like maybe could there be any book readings? I'd love to maybe hear something like that in the future, or what else we could be expecting. Anything you'd like to plug? Feel free.
Yeah, sure. I'm having a kind of a party for the book in Manhattan at this new bookstore on Orchard Street in just south of Houston in Manhattan on Sunday, the 14th of May. And afterwards, there's going to be a live metal karaoke band. So
Oh God.
could
Well,
be fun. Should come on down. The bookstore has a really weird name. It's called P&T Knitwear,
I'm marking it on my
Knitwear.
calendar now.
I guess it used to be like some kind of clothing store or something, and they kept the name. But it's on Orchard Street, just south of Houston, Sunday, May 14th. And I'm going to be talking with an amazing writer, this Jamaican writer named Marlon James, who won the Booker Prize in England a couple years back. And he's a real badass, actually.
Awesome.
And after that, heavy metal karaoke.
I will be there. I will be there, and I look forward to meeting you in person.
Cool, yeah. It'd be good to hang.
Yep, and I live in Manhattan, so I'll be able to walk there. So
awesome.
Yep. But thank you so much, everybody. We are here with novelist John Wray. Gone to the Wolves. Be sure to pick that up. This is Alex from Heavy New York, and we will see you next time.
Take care.